That morning, the city of Redwood Falls was shrouded in a quiet drizzle. Tiny droplets traced long paths down the windshield, as if the sky itself were trying to wash something away. In the parking lot of Morning Maple Diner, number 18, an old, beat-up silver pickup truck had just pulled in. Inside, the man sat perfectly still, his hands gripping the steering wheel lightly, his gaze fixed on the diner before him. On his chest, the name tag read Neil Foster, a faded name embroidered on a worn flannel shirt. But his real name was Caleb Morrigan. 52 years old, the founder and CEO of the Maple & Co. restaurant chain. A brand famous for its slogan, "We serve from the heart, not for the bottom line." He wasn't here for breakfast. The toast he'd bought from the gas station across the street was still in a paper bag on the passenger seat, nor was he here to check on revenue or food quality things already covered in quarterly reports from the monitoring department. No, Caleb was here for something that couldn't be captured in numbers, a nagging feeling, like the sound of water dripping in the night, a suspicion that something was rotting from within the very system he had so carefully built. From his truck, he could see the silhouettes of employees moving back and forth behind the steamed-up glass door. Everything looked in its place. But he'd been in this business long enough to recognize when something was out of rhythm, an unhealthy stillness, as if everyone were acting out a play they had rehearsed too many times, with no emotion left in it. The report from HR said this branch was doing well on revenue, even exceeding targets for 3 consecutive quarters. But its turnover rate was the highest in the region, and its employee engagement scores were flatlined. Caleb remembered something he'd told his regional management team nearly a decade ago. If you want to know if a restaurant is healthy, don't ask the manager. Watch how the staff pours coffee at 7 a.m. Today, he had returned to see it for himself. Caleb opened the car door, stepping out into the thin mist that still clung to the pavement. He pulled his baseball cap down low, adjusting his walk into the slight, weary limp of a man tired from a long drive. No one recognized him. No one looked up. There was only the gentle chime of a small bell as he pushed open the glass door, announcing the presence of a stranger. He chose a booth in the corner, a spot with a panoramic view where he was least likely to be noticed. From there, he saw it all, the dim amber lighting, the peeling paint beneath the service counter, and the faces of the staff, young, tired, and invisible. And then he saw her. A girl with her hair tied back neatly, her apron slightly faded but kept clean, moved between tables with an unusual composure. Not hurried, not distracted, simply attentive. She didn't draw attention, didn't speak up, but from the very first moment, Caleb knew there was something about her that would change everything. Her name was June. Caleb only learned her name when she placed a coffee mug on his table without making a sound. "Black coffee and toast," she said, her voice soft but not weak. "I added butter and jam just in case you need it." She didn't smile, just a faint upturn of her lips, enough to not seem cold. But to Caleb, that smile never reached her eyes, and in that moment, He knew June was the only one in this room who was still, truly present. He nodded, thanked her, then spoke as if he were just another stranger killing time. Mornings must be busy. The tips must be pretty good around this time. June paused for just a beat. Not long enough for anyone else to notice. But Caleb saw it. A hesitation that didn't show in her hands, but in her eyes. A faint flicker of light that came and went. She replied, "Tips are rarely great this early. And even when they're shared, not everyone gets them." Her voice dropped, almost lost in the whir of the coffee machine behind her. But to Caleb, every word she spoke was as clear as an alarm bell. He didn't ask more. He just lifted the coffee mug to his lips and set it down after the first sip. The coffee was cold. But the bitterness wasn't in the drink. The real bitterness was in the girl's words. The story of tips not being shared equally sounded familiar, something every restaurant faced. But the way June said, "Not everyone gets them," carried a completely different meaning, a kind of coldness that had nothing to do with the weather, but with people. Caleb watched as she returned to her work. Table 4 needed a water refill. Table 9 had just ordered more toast. Every step, every gesture revealed one thing: June wasn't just working. She was shouldering the entire weight of that space. Then he saw two others, a male employee with slicked-back hair named Zach, his shirt crisply pressed, a ready smile on his face, and an older man named Connor standing next to him. Both stood near the POS machine, but neither was carrying food, neither was wiping tables, neither was serving anyone. They only touched the screen, processed payments, and stood with their arms crossed, watching. June was different. She expertly pushed a cart of dirty dishes, bent down to wipe a spill without breaking her stride, and refilled coffee for a customer without forgetting her gentle, faint smile. She wasn't running, but she was always on time. Caleb waited for her to return, then asked casually, "Why don't you just handle the payments yourself to make it easier?" June didn't stop working, but as she leaned down to pick up an empty plate, she tilted her head and whispered, "I don't have access to the POS machine. The role assignments only grant access to certain people. I'm just supplemental support." Caleb froze. Supplemental support. The phrase, seemingly administrative, landed with an unusual weight in his chest. It wasn't a job description. It was a way to make someone disappear. "So who assigns the roles?" he asked, his gaze now steady and direct. June subtly nodded toward the front counter, where a man was laughing with a regular customer, dark blue shirt, a fountain pen clipped to his breast pocket, his demeanor just confident enough to be popular. Logan Bryce, the branch manager, Zach's uncle. The sentence was as light as the wind. But inside, Caleb felt the distinct tremors of a small earthquake beginning. The POS system was designed to be fair, to assign permissions based on actual roles, to log every person's contributions clearly. But here, someone had manipulated it. Someone was pretending to operate correctly while silently funneling power and benefits to their own relatives. And he knew, if June hadn't spoken, no one would have known. And if he hadn't been here today, everything would have continued as if nothing was wrong. Caleb sat still, but his eyes never rested. From his hidden corner booth, he could look directly at the POS counter where Zack stood as if it were his throne. He didn't serve. He didn't wipe tables. He didn't check on customers. His only job was to touch the screen swiper card, press confirm, and slip his hands into his pockets like a man counting another person's wages. Connor, the one with Zack, was no different. He moved less than the bar stools behind the counter, occasionally nodding at a customer. But no one called his name. No one needed him. All the morning's tips passed through these two. And June, who had served most of the tables in the 40 minutes Caleb had been watching, hadn't touched the POS once. Caleb glanced at the table next to him. The customers had just left. The coffee had been refilled, new toast brought out, napkins refolded. June had done it all, but on the receipt, the tip signature was linked to Zack's account. This was no longer a coincidence. This was a structure. When June passed by again, he asked quietly, almost in a murmur, "You really can't get into the computer, can't input anything at all?" June leaned in, clearing the dirty dishes, her eyes not meeting his, but her voice reaching deep into his core. The POS only allows access to employees with assigned roles. Those without a specific role are classified as supplemental support. Like me, they call us support, but what it really means is unrecorded. Caleb fell silent, for the first time feeling his hand grip the cold coffee mug a little too tightly. That statement, which sounded like a simple administrative matter, was in fact the first leak from a decaying system. A place where people used bureaucratic language to hide injustice. He looked up. Who assigns the roles? June didn't answer right away. She just glanced lightly toward Logan Bryce, the branch manager, who was laughing easily with a middle-aged customer. He's the one who arranges the schedules, assigns permissions, creates access accounts. Zack is his nephew. The last sentence was delivered on a breath, so soft, as if she herself feared the words would create aftershocks in the room. Caleb looked toward Logan, the perfectly ironed shirt, the shiny fountain pen, the impeccable posture of a model manager. But what lay beneath that veneer? A manipulated system, a back door that only family could enter, a POS machine configured to serve favoritism. June didn't know who he was, but she had just unwittingly done what no one else dared to. She had shown him the invisible hand that was twisting the very fairness at the heart of the restaurant he was once so proud of. And then she did something Caleb never expected. From her apron, she pulled out a thin notebook, its spine bent, the edges of its pages frayed and yellowed from being folded so many times. She didn't hand it to him directly. She just placed it lightly on the edge of the table as she walked by, then continued her work as if it were just another receipt. Caleb opened it. Inside was a treasure trove of evidence. Day by day, table by table, bill by bill, all meticulously recorded by hand. The personal effort of someone who didn't want to be dismissed as crazy for noticing something was wrong. On every page, there were two numbers, the total bill and the tip shown on the receipt. Below that was the amount of tip she actually received. The difference was circled in red pen. There were times, customer names, even small notes. Zach on the terminal. Connor took the payment. I served the whole table. Caleb sat stunned for a beat. He hadn't expected to find proof. His plan had been to just listen, then investigate discreetly later. But right here, right now, a young woman had done what his entire corporate oversight team couldn't. She had proven injustice with cold, hard facts. "I lost over $600 last month," June whispered when she returned. "But what hurts the most isn't the money. It's that no one asks who's dividing the tips and how are they being divided." Caleb closed the notebook, as if closing an unsentenced indictment. But inside him, the anger didn't erupt. It gathered quietly, just as the injustice here had been quietly gathering for months. He understood a restaurant could take a loss for a while. It could weather a storm of bad reviews. But if its best people start to believe the system doesn't see them, then the death of the organization has already begun. Caleb remained in his corner booth, June's notebook open before him like a small mirror, reflecting a truth no one wanted to face. He didn't turn any more pages. He didn't have to. The first 3 were enough to make everything clear. Every number matched what he had just witnessed with his own eyes, the tables June served, the bills Zach processed, and the tips which rightfully belonged to her being diverted elsewhere. But what made him catch his breath wasn't just the numbers. It was the way she wrote her notes. Not a single word of complaint, no accusations, just markers, brief lines, red circles, like someone asking themselves, "Am I imagining this? Or is something really wrong?" Caleb took a slow breath, gently pulling his phone from his jacket pocket. He angled it just enough, quietly photographing each page of the notebook. Each snapshot was a confirmation. She wasn't wrong. She wasn't paranoid. She just wasn't being heard. Then he took out a small sticky note and quickly wrote in clear letters, "Keep recording. Don't show this to anyone. I'll be back." He tucked the note into the front cover of the notebook, closed it gently, and pushed it toward the edge of the table, hiding it beneath the now cold coffee mug. Not a word, not a change in expression. But inside, everything was in motion. At the counter, Logan had just stepped into the small office in the back. Zach was leaning over the POS screen, his fingers tapping the keypad with the familiar speed of someone who didn't just know how to use the system but controlled it. Caleb narrowed his eyes. A flash of insight struck him. He wasn't just a cashier. He knew things others didn't, and he was exploiting what others weren't allowed to touch. Just then, a young employee who looked new was fumbling at table 5. She looked flustered with a tray of drinks, her eyes darting around as if looking for someone to ask for help. Connor walked right past her. No help. Zach didn't even bother to look. And then, as if fated, June appeared. She leaned down next to the new girl, patiently showing her how to adjust an order, how to enter allergy information, all in a low, warm, and patient voice. Then she said, just loud enough for only those very close to hear, "Avoid letting Zach enter orders for you. not because he'll get it wrong, but because he won't help. Caleb heard it, and to him, that sentence was like an arrow piercing through the polite facade of this system. June wasn't just working. She was carrying the branch's ethics on her shoulders. She was the only remaining moral anchor in a space where everyone else had chosen to stand still, avoid trouble, or ignore what they knew to be true. He looked back at the POS machine. Connor had just tried to log in, then grimaced. "That's weird. I could log in yesterday. Today it's giving me an access error." Zach didn't even look up, just smirked. "Probably a system glitch. I'll take care of it." Caleb didn't react, but in his mind, a map was beginning to form. A map with faint, connecting lines from the misconfigured POS to the deliberate role assignments, to the siphoned-off tips, and now to a girl who could no longer stay silent. This was no longer favoritism. This was a model, a design, an underground system disguised by procedure and run on the silence of the majority. But now, someone had written it down. Caleb tightened his grip on the coffee mug, his eyes locked on the POS, where Zach was still operating like an anonymous programmer in the heart of the diner. And he knew his time playing a role was over. It was time to come back, not with a baseball cap, not with a fake name tag, but as himself, with justice, and for the name this system was forgetting. June. Caleb didn't leave right after photographing the notebook. He sat, like a customer not quite ready to part with his old coffee, but in reality, his mind was calculating every next move. His intuition was confirmed. His emotions were stirred. But as a CEO, he knew intuition and emotion were no substitute for evidence. To change a system, he needed data. To expose the manipulators, he needed a map. And right now, June's notebook was the first piece of that map, a small piece, but enough to reveal the entire landscape. As June turned to get more toast for another table, Caleb opened his phone. It only took a few seconds to find the number. He dialed. A name appeared on the screen, Nina Dow, head of internal investigations at Maple & Co. The call lasted only 93 seconds, but it was long enough to start a storm. "Nina," he said, his voice low but firm. "We have a problem. The POS at Branch 18 is being manipulated. I need you to run a check on every account, every role assignment, every single tip recorded, everything, but do it quietly." On the other end of the line, Nina didn't ask questions. She had already shut down 3 fraudulent schemes within the system in just 4 years. No drama, no fanfare, just a series of quiet engagements followed by silent eliminations. This time would be no different. "Understood," Nina replied. Just a few hours later, the POS terminal at Branch 18 was put into stealth audit mode, a little-known internal function that allowed the tech team to monitor every action from who assigned what role, to every line of transferred money, to every edited command. Everything was recorded, without sending any external signal. At the diner, everything seemed the same. Customers were still having breakfast. June was still juggling 5 tables at once, and Zach was still standing behind the POS machine as if he owned it. No one knew that from this moment on, everything they did was being monitored at an encrypted level. The next morning, the first data sets were sent to headquarters. Nina called back. This time, she didn't need to say much. "We have enough to launch an internal proceeding." The first 3 findings made Caleb fall silent for a few seconds. First discovery. The system had been configured with a hidden access level named Internal Preferred that was not visible to regular employees. Only 3 people had this permission: Logan Bryce, manager; Zach Bryce, cashier; and a ghost account named Kitchen Support 03. Second discovery. Over the last 30 days, the total tips processed through the POS were over $4,800. Zach, despite handling only about 15% of the orders, had received 67% of the total tips. Third discovery. Kitchen Support 03 was a phantom account. The person listed, Marcus Hill, did not exist in the HR system. No tax records, no start date. But he had appeared at another branch, also under Logan's previous management 2 years ago. It was a sophisticated, programmed model. No one was stealing cash. No one was swiping fake cards. They just reconfigured roles, reconfigured who gets seen and who gets recorded. No one could be blamed, because on paper, everything was procedure. And that procedure was run by silent power, through the hands of those who knew how to hide behind the mask of system configuration. Caleb closed his phone, his face expressionless. But this time, there was no more doubt in his eyes, only a plan. "We're going back on Friday," he told Nina. 9 a.m. sharp, right at peak hour. No lawyers, no cameras, just us and the truth. A long night was ahead. But this time, he was no longer an outsider looking in. He was the one starting it. The rain outside had just stopped, but inside Caleb, a storm had officially been unleashed. Thursday, at 5:14 a.m. Caleb received an email from Nina with a single subject line: Preliminary Findings, Maple 18 Audit. There was no introduction inside, just 3 attachments. But when he opened them, each number became an accusation clear, cold, and undeniable. The first file, Access Logs, CSV. It showed a special access permission Internal Preferred, which did not exist on the public system. This role allowed the user to manipulate all entries from editing orders and routing tips to deleting history logs. The only 3 with this role were Logan Bryce, branch manager Zach Bryce, part-time employee Kitchen Support 3, a ghost account with no real profile in the HR system. Caleb paused at the last name. Kitchen Support 03, a pseudonym, a digital ghost. But Nina had gone further. The second file, Tip Flow Report, total POS tips over the last 30 days, $4,000, $837.26. Zach received $3,250.77, accounting for 67%, even though the number of tables he served was only 14. 6% June, who served the most tables, received only £228,054. The rest was scattered among various support accounts, most of which were either ghosts or backup accounts for employees who weren't actually on the work log. Nina's final note was the final dagger. This is not a misconfiguration. This is strategic theft. This wasn't a system error. This was strategic, systemic theft. Caleb leaned back, lacing his fingers in front of him, but before he could think further, his phone vibrated again. A text from Nina. Look at the third file. It's what you need. The third file. Transfer Trail, Douglas East. PDF. A recurring wire transfer every Friday. An internal processing fee was sent to a company named Douglas East Logistics LLC. At first glance, it looked legitimate, like a fee for an external contractor. But upon closer inspection, the company's registered address traced back to an old P.O. box once used by Logan Bryce before he was promoted to manager. The amount of money transferred through it matched to the cent the discrepancy that June had recorded in her notebook. It wasn't just about unfair tip sharing. It wasn't just about favoring a relative. It was a network of access abuse, siphoning tips, hiding behind ghost accounts, and then funneling the money to a shell company. Everything was camouflaged under two layers, a layer of feigned morality with a manager's smile, and a sophisticated technical layer hidden within the system. Caleb clenched his fist. The coffee in his cup had long gone cold, but the feeling inside him was no longer anger. It was clarity. June had no idea that her small notebook had unraveled an entire criminal operation. She was just trying to prove to herself that she wasn't imagining things, but with that same meticulous effort, she had accomplished what the entire internal audit department would have taken weeks to uncover. One person with no power, no role, had exposed a system, and now Caleb knew his next move wasn't just about dealing with a rogue manager. It was about redefining the very system he once believed to be fair. He stood up and called Nina back. Tomorrow, 9:00 a.m., I'm going to the branch. No advance warning. Bring copies of the entire audit. Bring the tablet. But don't say a word. Let the data speak for us. And this time, he wouldn't be wearing a baseball cap or hunching his back to feign exhaustion. He would arrive as the founder, with a single message: whoever does the work gets the credit. Whoever hides gets erased from the system. Friday, 9:06 a.m., peak hour. Inside the bustling space of Morning Maple Diner, number 18, the coffee machine whirred frantically. Plates clattered, and the smell of hot butter and bacon filled the room. June was still working, tray in hand, eyes scanning in every direction, handling an order while guiding a new employee who followed her. She didn't see him enter. No one did. Until the door opened. It wasn't the middle-aged man with the baseball cap and the limp from the last time. It was Caleb Morrigan, CEO and founder of Maple & Co., wearing the same charcoal grey suit he'd worn at the grand opening of their 50th branch. Behind him was Nina Dow, holding a tablet with the POS monitoring system already on screen. And as Caleb crossed the threshold, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Logan, who had been leaning against the counter, half smiling at a regular, froze mid-laugh. Zach, standing behind the POS machine with his hands entering a payment, suddenly faltered. Connor, in the middle of pouring coffee, seemed to freeze along with the carafe in his hand. Caleb wasn't harsh. He didn't need to introduce himself. He just walked straight to the counter, placing his hands firmly on its surface, as if putting a final period on a story that had gone on for far too long. "I won't take up much of your time," he began, his voice unusually calm. "Just the 15 years I spent building this company. No one moved. No one dared to blink." Caleb turned to look directly at Logan, no longer with a questioning gaze, but with the look of an owner confronting the man who had betrayed his greatest trust. "I once said, fairness isn't a slogan, it's a behavior, repeated every single day. But here, someone rewrote the rules." He nodded at Nina. She needed no further prompting. With a single swipe on the screen, 3 charts appeared. The tip distribution chart, 67% skewed towards Zach. The access permission list, Logan, Zach. The ghost account. The transfer schematic, money flowing to a shell company named Douglas East Logistics, linked to an old email address belonging to Logan. Caleb didn't need to say the company's name. Logan knew. Zach tried to speak, but before he could even open his mouth, Caleb quietly raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "You received 67% of the tips this month," he said, his eyes never leaving Zach. "Not because you worked harder, and not because you served more tables, but because you had the key to a door that other people didn't even know existed." The air in the diner grew thick, like freezing fog. June stood up straight for the first time that morning. The new employee beside her stopped wiping a table, staring at the counter with a look of both confusion and dawning realization. From the back of the kitchen, an older employee stepped out, his arms crossed, his eyes held no malice. But it was clear he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Caleb didn't need to raise his voice. He just needed to say what needed to be said. "Logan Bryce," he said, each word like a nail being hammered into wood. "As of this moment, you are suspended. Your file will be turned over to our legal department. Zach, you too. Maple has no place for people who turn transparency into a personal scam." He turned to the entire diner, his gaze sweeping over every person, not looking for fear, but for something else, restored faith. "If you are the one doing the real work, you will be seen. You will be compensated fairly. And if you hide behind a smile and system configurations, you will disappear. No matter how long you've stood behind that counter, no one clapped, no one cheered. This wasn't a Hollywood movie scene. This was a moment where the truth was spoken aloud, with a name, an address, and a consequence. And then he turned back to the POS machine, still displaying the screen Zach hadn't had time to log out of. Caleb pointed at it, then asked, "Who here has never been allowed to touch this machine?" All eyes turned toward the back of the counter. A young, small-framed employee in a wrinkled shirt stood near the kitchen door, looking bewildered. "What's your name?" Caleb asked, smiling for the first time. Danny," he stammered. Caleb nodded, took a step back, and pointed to the POS. "Danny, as of today, you will be the first person to use this system under the new access mode." Danny stepped forward, his hand trembling as he placed it on the machine for the first time in his life. He saw his own name displayed, no middleman, no support role, no longer hidden. The whole diner said nothing, but everyone understood the old boundary had just been broken. A new era had just begun with a single, simple act, letting a real person log in with their own name. As Danny placed his hands on the POS keyboard, his fingers trembled slightly. A thin sheen of sweat formed on his brow. Part of it was nerves. The other part was because this was the first time in his 3 months of working here that he had seen his own name appear on the payment screen. Not someone else's name, not a backup ID, but Danny M., with the role of a real server. Nothing more, nothing less. And the strange thing was, nothing exploded. No sirens wailed, no one yelled, but that very silence was the loudest sound the room had ever heard. Caleb took a step back, slipping his hands into his vest pockets, his expression no longer angry, but serene. It was the look of a man who had just untied a knot that had been pulled tight for far too long. At the counter, Zach stood motionless, his lips pressed into a thin line, not out of regret, but because he knew. The game was over. Logan, who had now returned from the back office, said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He just looked at Caleb, then at Zach, and nodded a nod that was like a final admission. We knew what we were doing, and we know we've been caught. No verdict was needed, only a look. In the corner of the room, June gently set her tray down on a counter, remaining silent. But for the first time in her shift that day, her back was straight. Her shoulders were no longer slumped. Her hands were no longer clasped in front of her stomach as they usually were. Emily, one of the newer employees, walked over and lightly touched June's arm. No words were spoken, but the touch was a thank you that needed no explanation. You held on to justice when the rest of us didn't dare to look at it. Caleb turned to Nina. She was standing beside the tablet, swiping to a second screen where a map of the entire POS system appeared. Green dots were branches that had been cleared. Red dots were branches showing signs similar to branch numbered 18, and the number was growing. We weren't just monitoring this branch, Nina said, her voice calm. The entire system is being re-audited, quietly, but it can't be hidden anymore. The old access cards were deactivated that same morning. The hidden admin permissions erased from the system. The phantom kitchen support accounts permanently locked. From now on, only those who were physically present with real hours worked would be recorded, would have access, and would be paid correctly. But the biggest change wasn't in the software. It was in the eyes of the employees. Where there was once silence, now there was directness. Where there was once suspicion, now there was confirmation. Where June once stood, shouldering the burden alone, now the whole team stood with her. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. We don't have to put up with what's wrong just because it's labeled procedure anymore. Caleb looked around the room one last time, his gaze finally resting on where June was standing. This time, she looked up, no longer hesitant, no longer evasive. She looked him straight in the eye and gave a slight nod, a nod that needed no thanks, no explanation. A nod from someone who had been seen. Morning Maple Diner number 18 didn't play music in the mornings, nor did it have the cheerful advertisements of other big chains. But on that day, as the system operations were reset, a new sound rang out, small, steady, and full of weight. Ting. Each sound was a tip being recorded transparently. Each sound was a name no longer hidden. 8:46 a.m. The screen displayed table 19, 93 bill, $20 tip. June T. Table 35, 41-pound bill, $8 tip. Danny M. Table 62, $75 bill, $14 tip. Emily R. No one had to ask any more. Will the tip reach me? Did someone else take my name? Do I even exist in this system? Everything now was clear down to the last pixel. Caleb sat back down in a quiet corner, no longer the stranger from his first visit. But he was no longer the CEO who entered with overwhelming authority either. He was simply the man who had seen and chosen not to turn away. At the counter, June no longer had to juggle 7 tables at once. She worked more calmly, with less stress. But strangely, her service speed was more efficient than before, because now she no longer had to carry the weight for those who did nothing. No one was allowed to hide in the system anymore. No support role could be used to evade responsibility or steal the credit for someone else's work. And most importantly, there were no more averted gazes during breaks. Instead, people started calling each other by their names, for their roles, for their work, for their value. 2 weeks later, June was officially appointed regional training lead, without an application, without an interview. She didn't bring a PowerPoint or presentation slides. She only brought her story. And an old notebook now unbound, each page laminated, used as a training document. At branch number 31, an employee named Tanya cried when she saw her name appear on the tip screen for the first time. I didn't know that I had the right to exist like this. At branch number 7, an employee who had quit came back to work not for higher pay, but because I don't need special treatment. I just need to know I'm not being erased from history anymore. At the corporate headquarters, Caleb reviewed the quarterly report. Revenue hadn't skyrocketed, profits hadn't spiked, but there was a single line that he underlined in red: employee turnover had decreased by 18% system-wide. But the line he circled wasn't a metric. It was a question added to the internal survey unannounced. Unexplained. Do you feel seen in your work? No one was required to answer. There was no reward for saying yes. But over 82% of employees chose yes. Not because they were paid more, but because they were called by their proper names. Caleb smiled. Then he stood up, without calling a meeting, without sending a company-wide thank you email. He just went back to where it all began. A month had passed since that morning, the morning when justice didn't knock with a steel hammer, but walked in quietly with a cold cup of coffee and a direct gaze. Morning Maple Diner number 18 had changed now. Not with a new coat of paint or new uniforms, but with a new rhythm of life. No more scenes of June running between 6 tables, looking exhausted. No more suspicious glances between shifts. Instead, there was a very different sound, the soft click of restored trust. The steady ting from the modern POS system with its redesigned interface so that everyone could see who was serving, who received the tip, who was responsible. No more phantom accounts, no more support roles, no more invisible names. And on the digital display, every time a tip was recorded, the server's name lit up next to the order. Not flashy, no special effects, but enough for that person to be present fairly and completely. June was no longer a server. She had become the regional transparency lead, a new title that had never existed before at Maple & Company, created specifically for her to lead other branches in reforming to the new model. She didn't have her own office, no assistant, no leather swivel chair, just a backpack, an old plastic laminated notebook, and a story no one could deny. At branch number 42, a new employee named Nena sent June a text after her first day of work. I used to think work was just for survival. But today, when I saw my name appear on the POS screen with my first tip, I cried. Because for the first time, I felt real. At branch number 17, a former employee who had quit because there was no room for him asked to come back. He didn't ask for more money, didn't need a promotion. He just said one thing: I don't need privileges. I just need to know I won't be erased every time my shift ends. At the corporate office, Caleb reviewed the new system report. 89% of employees had logged in with their own IDs. 93 branches had adopted the transparent POS interface. Turnover at the reformed branches had dropped by 24%, but the last line had no numbers, just a single sentence italicized, not bold. Not all employees want a raise. Some just want to be called by their name. Caleb signed the decision to keep the public POS mode permanent. No need to wait for a 6-month review, no need for a trial run. Because some things don't need a trial, they just need to be right. That morning, Caleb returned to Maple number 18. No suit, no tablet, no entourage. Just him, the same man who had once sat alone in the corner of the diner, quietly observing the indifference that was called operations. This time, the diner was still busy, but the atmosphere was completely different. Danny stood confidently behind the counter, handling each order with ease. Emily was guiding a new employee, showing them the ropes just as June had once shown her. And June was standing near the POS, no longer serving. She was showing a new group of employees how to check their access permissions before starting their shift. Her voice was clear, rhythmic, not raised at all, but it made everyone who heard it stand a little taller, not through authority, but through the credibility forged in those silent, unrecorded shifts. Caleb sat down at his old table. Coffee was brought out. Pancakes, too. No one recognized him, and he liked it that way. Before leaving, he folded a $20 bill and placed it under the plate. Then he wrote a few short lines, folded the small piece of paper, and placed it under the money. Thank you for writing it down when everyone else chose to look away. You're not alone now, and neither are the others. When June came to clear the table after the morning rush, she found the neatly folded bill under the pancake plate. No one was sitting there anymore. No pat on the back, no words of praise. Just a small piece of paper, with a familiar handwriting not fancy, but enough to make her eyes pause. Thank you for writing it down when everyone else chose to look away. You're not alone now, and neither are the others. She didn't cry. She just let out a very soft breath, as if setting down a burden she had carried for far too long. She folded the note and pressed it between the last 2 pages of her notebook, the one she no longer carried with her, but still kept safe like a piece of her own spine. That evening, June sat alone in her small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building. She took out the old notebook. The pages were creased at the corners, the red ink still bold, and there were even a few spots where the ink had smudged from a tear on a day when she hadn't dared to admit to herself that she had lost all hope. But this time, she didn't reread it. She didn't need to anymore. Instead, she carefully removed each page, not to throw them away, but to start passing them on. She placed each page into a white envelope. On the front, she wrote no recipient's name, just a single line, neat and sincere. To the one who comes next. If you ever need proof that you're not crazy for seeing something wrong, and that you are not alone for choosing to speak up. The next morning, the envelope was left on a work desk at Maple Diner branch number 33, which had just begun implementing the new POS system. No sender's name, no urgent label, no secretary, no confirmation of receipt. Just a reminder, for someone she had never met, that justice doesn't start with a rallying cry. It starts with one person who keeps records, one person who sees something wrong and chooses not to walk past it as if it were invisible. In the new system, the name June Tran was more than just a line in the HR database. She no longer needed a role to gain access. She had become a role, not a position, but a symbol for all those who had ever felt unseen yet persisted, quietly documenting every injustice. And because of that, she didn't need to give speeches. She didn't need to train with slides. She just needed to be present, to stand next to the new person, to lightly touch their shoulder when they doubted themselves, and to say the one sentence she once wished someone had said to her. Someone once asked Caleb Morrigan, during a private workshop with other service industry CEOs, what truly saves a company strategy, profit or innovation? He replied very softly, the feeling of being seen, not with an Employee of the Month award, not with a poster in the break room, but when the janitor knows their name is recorded in the system, when the server knows the tip they earned isn't being routed to a phantom kitchen support account, when someone dares to speak up and isn't punished for telling the truth. 1 month, then 3, Then 6 months after that morning at Maple Diner number 18, the numbers continued to prove something June had understood long before the system changed. Fairness isn't a policy. Fairness is a commitment repeated, consistent, even when no one is watching. Turnover dropped by 26%. The number of internal complaints was nearly zero. And most notably, a single question was added to the end of the periodic HR survey: no prompting, no mandatory response. This week, did you feel seen? Not everyone chose yes, and for that reason, Maple & Co. continued to improve, because they understood the feeling of being forgotten is silent, but it rots the culture of an organization from the inside out. One early morning, Caleb returned to Maple number 18, not to inspect, but to sit in his old corner, drink coffee, and watch the rhythm of the place. No one recognized him. It wasn't necessary. The coffee was poured by Emily. Her name appeared on the tip screen, just as it should. Napkins were folded by Danny, and this time a new employee greeted him by name. June walked by, no longer carrying a tray, but giving a slight nod to each person not above them, just one step ahead, before turning back, before leaving. Caleb left one last thing on the table: a new, blank notebook, a soft leather cover. No company logo, no motivational quote, just one page, the first one, written in blue ink. Fairness doesn't come from the position you hold. It comes from being willing to rewrite things when you see something wrong. The next page is yours. Some injustices don't scream. They just quietly repeat themselves until someone is willing to look. And sometimes, to change a system, you don't need a speech. You just need a notebook, a name recorded correctly, and one person who refused to look away.